Pues muy buenas tardes a todos, bienvenidos a nuestra última sesión del día, muy acalorado, muy buenas discusiones, excelentes presentaciones. No podemos cerrar con mejor mesa para seguir discutiendo sobre la decolonización, qué emocionante. Por eso hablo en español, no es que sea mi inglés malísimo, sino ahora nos toca hablar en español. Bienvenidos a todos, nuestra primer conversación, presentaciones NAOMI, seguiremos con la de Alan y finalmente en línea tendremos a Enrique. Pues sin más preámbulos, bienvenida. Buenas tardes.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, Johanna. Hola a todos y todas. Yo soy Naomi Oosterman, soy una doctora en criminología de la Universidad Erasmus en Rotterdam, Países Bajos, y tengo el privilegio por estar aquí en México, Ciudad de México. Estoy muy feliz y muchas gracias para me tener, to have me, pero mi español es fatal, entonces cambiaré en inglés, okay? So, now in English, I am, well, first I want to thank the organizers again for organizing and hosting such a wonderful conference with such a rich variety of topics in such a wonderful city. My name is Naomi Oosterman. I am an assistant professor of cultural heritage at Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and I am definitely part of the wide variety in here because I am a criminologist specialized in the policing of art and heritage crimes and the illicit trafficking of antiquities, and as such, I will be talking to you today about some of the issues in relation to the policing of heritage crimes in Latin America and the role of documentation therein, or perhaps maybe even the absence of documentation therein. So I am not so much presenting a database or software or a particular project here today. This is part of my research and my ongoing research in Latin America. And I'm going to talk a bit about how a lack of documentation and linked data, or actually simply just working together, can lead to criminogenic spaces, spaces where crime can flourish. I need to do the arrow, yes. So first I want to talk to you a bit about what heritage crimes are, of course in the context of Latin America. Now in general, art and heritage crimes are all crimes associated to art and cultural heritage in really the broadest sense of the word. We are talking about criminal activities relating to, for example, archaeological artifacts, art, archives, paleontological materials and fossils, but also human remains and digital heritage. For example, NFT art. Art and heritage crimes, then, are all those activities that are connected to these artifacts, such as theft, looting, forgeries, money laundering, trafficking, fencing, and taking then place in a variety of locations that can be physical or not, such as offline or online marketplaces, museums and galleries, of course, private residencies, flea markets. The world is your playground if you are an art criminal. However, effectively, there is no such thing as art and heritage crime, as such being defined by criminal law as being art and heritage crime. These are umbrella terms, which is normal. There's also no such thing as drug crime. There are just crimes and criminal activities related to drugs. As such, there's no such thing as art and heritage crime. However, art and heritage crime is protected and is protected by law. And particularly in Latin America, many of the countries in Latin America claim blanket ownership of what in many countries is called patrimonio cultural, patrimonio nacional, which I am really now roughly translating to national or cultural patrimony. So what this effectively means is that states in Latin America do not allow objects of cultural and national significance to exit the country without prior approval of an authority body. And this is rather important for this context, as since approximately the 1960s, Latin American artifacts have been increasingly popular on international art and antiquities markets. So specialized dealers and targeted auction sales were developed to meet this increased consumer demand, particularly for the artifacts from Latin America. However, as you can imagine, or maybe you don't, but we have heard other decolonial topics today, the market supply of this was and is problematic. Most Latin American countries, as I said, claim blanket ownership of all heritage items within their territory, which prohibits their extraction, transfer, and export for market purposes. For lending to other museums, for example, yes, but for market purposes, no, unless there is consent. But even then, you cannot simply sell patrimonio cultural. In the context of Mexico, that's where we are, of course, the first laws date back to the early 1820s, already right after the independence, which already at that moment prohibited the extraction of archaeological material, which is how it was called by law, from the country. By 1890, so we're not talking about 2 weeks ago, not even talking about 50 years ago, not even talking about 100 years ago, 1890, by law, all, again, as written in the law, pre-colonial archaeological heritage from Mexican territory belongs to, you've guessed it, Mexico. So everything from before pre-colonial, everything from pre-colonial times belongs to Mexico and should stay within. Now, there's a hurt there, right? Because I just said since the 1960s, there has been an increased demand for artifacts, also definitely from Mexico, but the laws already existed since 1825, the first ones for archaeological material, and 1890 for all pre-colonial artifacts. So we have an illicit supply stream, right? Because there was no possibility for illicit supply stream at that time. So without that, dealers and consumers of especially non-contemporary Latin American art turned to material that was looted or stolen from its country of origin, smuggled to a market country and sold via a series of opaque or cloudy or shady market practices that simply serve to hide the object's illicit origins. An object is never illegal. Object cannot legally be illegal. You cannot throw an object into jail. So we talk about an illicit origin. So the resulting ancient and historic Latin American art market that we know today is saturated with at least over 6 decades worth of illicit material. The documentation, identification and recovery of which remains an ongoing challenge, not only for local communities who see effectively their identity looted and traded for profit, but also for the policing and the enforcement of this type of crime. Because as a criminologist and a specialist in crime, I can tell you that without data and without proper documentation, it is impossible to enforce criminal behavior. And when I talk about enforcement, I talk about policing. And in relation to, I will explain what that is, but in relation to heritage crimes, local policing efforts, so policing, for example, here in Mexico or in Peru, represent the first and maybe even the most important line of defense against art and heritage crimes. Local police are tasked with both the prevention and the investigation of heritage crimes, and particularly with combating the trafficking of cultural heritage, because that is just very prevalent in regions that, the literature calls it source countries, so archaeologically rich countries, or countries of origin, which is a bit of a more egalitarian way of calling it. Because objects tend to, the theft tends to take place, or looting tends to take place to supply to this market demand. And these markets tend to be in, I don't like the Western, non-Western, or global North, global South, but the markets tend to be located in the global North. The source or the origin tends to be located in the global South. But policing effectively, in the broadest sense of the word, refers to the enforcement of law, so the enforcement of criminal law, and maintaining order and safety within a given space, a given community, or a given country. Now, probably the majority of us, although we are actually in Latin America, so maybe not, but perhaps the Europeans among us immediately think about public police, but policing encompasses a really large variety of practices carried out by several actors. So although policing is very much a delineated and well-studied concept within criminology, the more recent use of the word or the term plural policing fits contemporary policing practices better, as it refers to the act of carrying out policing tasks by different actors that work independently, collaboratively, or in conflict with one another. And then, of course, we did discern between public police, private policing, which is then security. That's why I was saying that is omnipresent in Mexico. Every hotel, every shop, there is private security, or community policing. And the issue, who in one way or another, so these three different actors in one way or another, they work either above, below, beyond, or through government. So in one way it is connected to central government and central governance, but they don't always work collaboratively because they have different ideas about what to police, or different perspectives on what to police, or they simply are, there's differences between public and private components of policing. Now, that friction is particularly visible within the policing of heritage crime. I am not going to say that this is exclusively visible in heritage crime, not at all, but this is just, I'm talking here about heritage crime, that is my love field. So then how do you police heritage crime? There is no particular standard for policing heritage crime, and it is particularly difficult to police it. And why is it particularly difficult? Because things like drugs and weapons, they have quite a known and a solid, for example, street value. There is some sort of worth associated to it. If you steal something, yeah, the book of law is quite easy in that. You did something that was simply against the law. When we talk about art and when we talk about cultural heritage, or when we talk about antiquities, yeah, sure, a market has started to exist for these objects, but they are objects of cultural significance, and cultural significance is difficult to evaluate. Would it be culturally significant if it is in a museum? Is it culturally significant if it's important for a community? And is it therefore then valuable to police? And those are questions that perhaps people in the audience here, I hope, would say yes, of course, because these are, cultural heritage is the physical manifestation of our identity. It is community's identity, it's individual identity, so obviously it needs to be policed. I will invite you all to the Netherlands where the ideas are. I'm joking. But these are things that are not so tangible, and if there's one thing the law doesn't like, it's intangible components. Because you need to have a clear boundary. So it is very difficult to police art and heritage crimes. Unless an object is stolen from a museum, then it's very easy, because it was there before and now it's not. But predominantly, the policing of heritage crimes follow the principle of what is called intelligence-led policing. And in intelligence-led policing, this is predominantly in the public police, the public police functions more as what scholars call an information broker. So they provide information to the public in order for us, the public, to sort of manage and mitigate risk. And in relation to art and heritage crimes, this is predominantly done through different types of databases that are on different levels of governance, right? So there's public international or public national databases, like Interpol's Stolen Work of Art database, and the ID Art app. We have private and commercial databases, such as the Art Loss Register, and we have community-based databases, so local communities themselves registering, for example, heritage or objects or whatever located within their communities. And this is wild, because you don't see that so often with other things. Sure, you have an Interpol Most Wanted list. If you know that, Interpol Most Wanted list, there are calls, for example, for to look out for dangerous individuals, but it's not necessarily that often that you have relatively public databases that are open to the public for you to then see or to check if objects have been stolen, with a clear appeal of either creating a registry so that things that are stolen might be recovered, or to see, okay, is something stolen, yes or no? That is rather unique within the field of crime in general, that you have such an open database with so much police data, because effectively the police is one thing and it's rather closed for civilians, to say it like that. So the issue with these databases, I already named 3, there's like a ton, is not just the interoperability of these databases, or a lack of cross-sectoral collaboration. Private doesn't necessarily always want to work with public. but predominantly the incompleteness of these databases. So art and heritage crimes, they suffer from a high rate of what us criminologists like to call a dark figure. So these are all crimes that happen, but are not registered to the police. And that is relevant to understand because police databases usually only get used once a crime has been committed and that particular crime is then also registered. Now, we already heard in several presentations, today, yesterday, the day before, that museum and gallery documentation is not always state-of-the-art. Museums tend to, in general, be underfunded in relation to creating documentation or registrations, depending on where you are. Standards such as object ID are not always implemented completely or at all. And of course, the most difficult thing, and also particularly relevant to the Latin American context, is objects, I say objects, at heritage sites that perhaps we do not know to exist, cannot be stolen. So this is like if a tree falls, if a tree falls and no one is there, can we hear it? It's the same with looting from archaeological heritage sites. If we did not know, for example, of the existence of a site, or if a site was not registered or documented with individual pictures and data and whatnot, yeah, then effectively it's not stolen. Of course it is. Like, obviously it is, but it's not registered, and then there is not a crime. And then sometimes criminologists are like, okay, my work here is done. But that is effectively what it is, and this happens all the time. And this is effectively what leads then to something we like to call object laundering. So an object that had illicit origins, was looted, for example, and trafficked, can get implemented into the licit market. It can get, okay, provenance and due diligence, you know, problems with that. But if it gets sold on a licit market, yeah, then you have a problem. An object that, again, was, right, part since the 1890s, other countries, 1850s, was now part of national patrimony. And now it's actually laundered or into a licit market. And unfortunately, that also means that these objects that in Latin America are mostly protected by administrative law now go into the hands of private law. And then it becomes private ownership and private property. So in paper, there's no crime, but in reality, of course, you have a market that gets saturated. Databases are intended to stop that, or to sort of try to prevent that by creating a space where these objects get registered. But of course, again, some are simply just a crime committed, and now it's in a database. Others are, okay, I am rich enough with a nice collection, I can register it with a private organization, and then I am, you know, relatively protected. But the dark figure means that we have not even a fraction of all the art and heritage, and this is in the entire world. This is not simply or exclusively Latin America. We just don't know the exact scale of this. So whenever there's an organization that says it's the third or fourth biggest, or it's billions, there's not really a statistical merit for that. We cannot know the exact scale. We can only really strongly presume, seeing what happens in European art markets, seeing what is exhibited in museums, that there is a big market for it. That we know. Now, another big issue with the documentation, I'm speeding up. Yeah, so we're only the two of us now, right?
No, 3.
Oh, we're still 3. Okay, shit, I was about to take someone else's time. Okay. Another big issue is that of misreporting. That's a little bit what the model is saying here. The reality of art and heritage crime is that you really just have a handful of dedicated police officers, 4 or 5, in a country as big as Mexico, or as big as, well, as small as the Netherlands. It is nothing. That is the exact, I'm not saying this percentually, no, this is 5 actual individuals that are tasked with this. So you only have a handful of police officers that hopefully are specialized, or you simply have none. This despite the fact that the United Nations General Assembly in 2018 actually argued, and I'm going to quote now, that in a resolution, that the resolution encourages all member states to establish, with the assistance of Interpol, specialized police units exclusively dedicated to the protection of cultural heritage, while also stressing once again the importance of connecting national stolen works of art databases with Interpol databases. So there is a urge coming from the UN to centralize information. Yes, I am seeing it. Yes, thank you. But the problem that you see here, this is a very basic presentation. An object gets, for example, stolen, gets looted. First, it has to go through local police. Then it has to go to a national coordinating bureau that is affiliated to Interpol, if this is the public side. Then it might get implemented into the stolen works of art database, but if there's no pictures or if there's not enough indicators for object ID, it will just simply go back. It will go all the way back to local police. It will get registered as simple property theft, and then once again, art and heritage crime did not take place. So I think we heard it in the panel before or in this morning, when the more documentation information needs to swap hands, the more information you also lose, the more you get rid of. So now one of the primary challenges here is that of interoperability of databases, as I said, not in the technical sense, because I think this conference has shown us that we have a lot of technical expertise that goes at least way over and beyond my intelligence, but it is the impossibility of linked data within and between these databases. Interpol makes use of linked data, sure, but mostly between their 19 different databases. There are collaborations here and there between public, private, and community, but they pretty much, that is not automated. It is pretty much literally with the sharing of police intelligence, sometimes even through the phone. And police intelligence just doesn't move very, very fast. Additionally, another problem is that these databases are very static. Sometimes items remain in these databases when they are already recovered. Sometimes there are updates on objects and they are not included in there. So like we heard, I think, Dominic saying on Monday, especially within art and heritage crimes, these databases, they remain very, very static. And criminals can misuse these databases also as a way of performing due diligence and provenance checks. Because they will say, I say this very basically, it's not on the Interpol Stolen Works of Art database, it's not listed, so it's not stolen, so I bought this in good faith. And there you go, object laundering. So I am at my final slide. I listed this slide as the way forward, but honestly I've been thinking about this for the last 10 years, but more recently, like in the last 24 hours, after listening to a lot of presentations, I have to admit that I myself do not even have an answer to this. I can make a few statements that are obvious. Yeah, more money to the policing of art and heritage crime. Actually, more pluralization of governance, but hierarchical. More diversification of art and heritage and what constitutes national patrimony in such a way that indigenous communities and their heritage are also equally represented by the criminal law. But for now, I hope I just gave you a peek into the complexities of using databases and how this can and how this functions within a criminogenic space. I want to thank you very much, and that was it.
Muchas gracias, Naomi. Perdón por ser la policía del tiempo.
No, please. I am sorry.
Podemos continuar, ¿verdad? ¿Claro? Sí, perfecto. Nuestra siguiente participación es a cargo de ABREU, que no está aquí, pero su presentación está grabada. Hasta donde entiendo.
Oh. So I could have taken...
Okay. We'll have the time. Don't steal time. No, grabada. Perdón por la espera, es que pensábamos todos que era un video, pero mandó el PowerPoint. Entonces, no sé si tenemos que actuar como Alan o si Alan está por aquí. ¿No es video? Pues solo mandó el PowerPoint, entonces para no, ¿cómo se llama?, desatinar, voy a pasar las diapositivas rápidamente para que se lleven una idea y darle el lugar a Enrique, que nos pueda transmitir desde remotamente su presentación. ¿Sí? ¿La presentamos? Entonces, personifico a Alan. Naomi, acompáñame a personificar. Join me too. Voy a dar un tiempo muy breve de lectura. Es muy conceptual, no creo que podamos poder representar lo que quería decir el doctor Alan. Bueno, pero seguramente están familiarizados con este proyecto de Humboldt Forum en Alemania, que trata de reunir todas las colecciones de distintos museos y ponerlas en un solo lugar y contextualizarlas. Me imagino que es una foto sobre las discrepancias que debe haber generado a nivel gobierno generar un proyecto así. Ahí todavía se ven felices. Es que yo me imagino un proyecto así en México y no estarían así de contentos, porque aquí las colecciones parece que son de las instituciones, no necesariamente custodian esos bienes, sino les pertenecen esos bienes. Entonces no me imagino a los 3 directores de nuestros distintos patrimonios llegando a acuerdos y estando alegres de que las colecciones salgan. Pero vemos que lograron poner por lo menos en línea numerosas colecciones y que digitalmente puedan convivir. Uf, son muchísimas. Felicidades. Creo que hay muchísimas diapositivas, entonces me voy a ir un poquito más rápido y ya no voy a hablar mal del proyecto Humboldt. Para que vean qué importante sería tener notas en la documentación. Entonces yo la voy a transmitir mal. Logró solucionar todos los problemas. Yo también trabajo en una plataforma mexicana que tiene que ver con la cosecha de distintos materiales de distintas instituciones, y creo que uno de los problemas que puedo ver es eso, la mediación de distintos ecosistemas institucionales en una sola plataforma digital. ¿Está Ala?
No, no.
Pero muy impresionante.
Parece que sí, el video.
La versión mexicana de la presentación Humboldt no gustó.
Cambio la pantalla, por favor.
Hello, it's great to be in Mexico. Y quiero decir al inicio también en español, que es lengua comadre para mí, cuánto me alegra poder tomar parte de esta conferencia aquí con ustedes en México, aun si es solo desde aquí en Berlín. Entonces, muchísimas gracias al equipo organizador, al Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas y a la UNAM para esta ocasión. My name is Alan PROHM. The title of my talk today is Decolonizing Online Collections Displays, Historical Tasks and Lost, Opportunities of the Humboldt Forum. I work as a concept designer for digital media at the creative agency The Green Isle in Berlin, where we understand ourselves as translators of complex content into transmedial exhibitions, installations, and digital applications. I am also periodically affiliated with the Institut für Kulturwissenschaft, Institute for the History and Science of Culture at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin, where I have taught seminars on the digital mediation of cultural heritage and am pursuing a research and writing project on these topics under Professor Dr. Claudia Marais, Chair of Design and the History of Knowledge. And between 2015 and 2020, I was tasked, along with a few others, with conceiving, planning, and implementing an overall digital offering for the new Humboldt Forum in Berlin, a complex institution and cultural undertaking which includes the exhibition spaces and a new presentation of the collections of the Ethnologisches Museum and the Museum für Asiatische Kunst. That's the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art of the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, the National Museums in Berlin. I'm of course not here to tell you how to decolonize digital collections displays, but to share with you experiences of where that task can be encountered today, how it can be confronted, and what difference that can make. My paper here addresses the Humboldt Forum directly as a concrete case study of media design, media concept design, and digital strategy, with special relevance to the global histories of knowledge, or to global histories of knowledge, and with special potentials for producing and learning to produce new, better, perhaps in a measure, decolonizing mediations of this cultural heritage, which, to give a conclusion before the argument, would mean for me mediations that do more to redistribute the values accruing in the movement of cultural materials and impulses from the world into collections at the hegemonial center. In particular, my short overview will argue the centrality of linked data solutions, coming down to metadata structuring and linking functions in the conceptualization and implementation of more relational rather than exclusivist identitarian collections display practices. These will also be held to be central in the evaluation of online digital collections displays launched to date. In doing this, I will follow the structure of a traditional case study, looking first at tasks, then at the solutions proposed, and then at results. And if I have time, I will end on a few ideas for how relational data practice can enable other or better, more contextualizing, more participative, more decolonizing knowledge platforms and knowledge practices around cultural heritage data. The task of decolonizing online collections displays can be approached under three guiding questions. Where is it given? How is it taken? And who evaluates? As to where it is given, within the last 10 years, dozens of museums, to speak just of Germany, have digitalized hundreds of thousands of objects each, stemming from collections activities around the world, across historical periods, and inevitably with heavy preponderances in the colonial period under colonial contexts. In every case, visions, strategies, concepts, plans, and tasks for the process of digitalization to undergo were more or less explicitly and more or less effectively developed and measurable results. This is where decolonizing the collections displays was given explicitly as part of the task. Fewer, and this becomes a value for distinguishing among presentations and online collections practice. I myself encountered this task with the publication in January or February of 2015 of a job opening for design of an overarching media concept, Mediengesamtkonzept, for the Staatliche Museen zu Berlin. The Humboldt Forum is a project with a particularly complex tasking structure in that it extends between the highest levels of national and European cultural politics, Berlin culture management, and the street-level creative economy culture industry in Berlin. The contents of the project were similarly complex as to how they posed and framed the task in hand. There was the planned reconstruction of the historical Berlin City Palace, seat of Germany's Prussian imperial legacy, and original destination of the colonial accumulations at issue in the collections. This inevitably made the project from the beginning a struggle of content with form, in which the digital hoped to play a decisive role. There was the program for 40,000 square meters of museum, event, and activity space, including the new presentation of the non-European collections of the national museums. And there was the contents themselves. First, the history of the Berliner Kunstkammer, early cradle of humanist and romantic sciences of nature, culture, and display, site of Leibniz's early lost, vision of a methodical science of relationality, and origin of the museum heritage on Berlin's Museum Island. Then also the modern heritage of Adolf Bastian's Museum for Völkerkunde, which sought to bring representative objects from all primitive cultures, Naturvölker, in view of extinction, together into a great universal archive of elementary human thoughts serving all of humanity. Most concretely and critically, the task involved a new presentation of these collections, each object from each culture and community speaking of knowledge projects and practice contexts in large part lost to history. The task as given felt like a bundle of the biggest and most contradictory ambitions coming together in an institution grown in part on the detestable tradition of the Imperial World Museum, while aiming to become a new kind of more than museum, a cosmopolitan forum of world cultures. So digitalize that. The task itself was given in a sequence of forms from the beginning of digital concept work in April of 2015 through the digital grand opening on December 16th, 2020. The solutions proposed took the form of concept proposals and planning documents of various sorts at various junctures between 2015 and 2020. Backed up each year with conference presentations and publications. Concretely, the proposals came down or the solutions came down to proposals put forward under three main headings: orientation, accompaniment, and connection, together with certain structural preconditions to enable the higher functions of this media and data system. The whole offering proposed included a media tower and information stela in the public areas for general orientation, a media guide for accompaniment through the museums, special media installations within the museum gallery spaces, standard media stations throughout, and as structural preconditions on an online platform, data linking for the algorithms, central data management, monitoring, and maintenance. All these nodes and touch points having at the center a yet to be defined content pool and a data integration pipeline for realizing these higher potentials of integrated and linked data work, which we saw in the potentials of curated semantic linking of the collection's data sets. Content was thus planned to be able to flow fluidly to any touch point, sensitive to the touch point and the user, to overcome atomization and bring wholes of thought, knowledge, and encounter to life. The culmination of this was to be the full content platform, a content viewer proposed in various formulations as collections viewer, content cosmos, and Humboldt Forum Digital. Already in first concept outlines as of July 2016, at the beginnings of the Humboldt Forum Kultur GmbH, the project or product had a general outline with core functions including presence and features, presence and availability of Humboldt Forum contents online, presence of partner institutions online, complete digital availability of Humboldt Forum contents on site and worldwide, presentation of the objects and thematic units for mediating them, a content viewer, presentation of the collections themselves, the collection viewer, presentation of the exhibitions, curated collection viewer for permanent and temporary exhibitions, and linking of the object and topic data sets in a Humboldt Forum semantic net. Search functions were to be enabled, as well as explorative functions, overview visualizations, behind password, CMS for content management, and tools for collaboration. In a number of conference appearances and publications, I was able to elaborate on this aspect of the long-term concept for the Humboldt Forum. The benefits mentioned then extended from this practice being more informative, yielding more information, better, more fluid, more correct information, being more efficient in the production and presentation, for being more Humboldtian, for giving a more on-brand delivery of the content precisely through this linking, and also in expressing provenance information, allowing the collection's histories to be told and explored. We were calling for the standardization of structuring of database content for handling and managing them, and the creation of and establishment of technical and structural infrastructure bases for data exchange through central data or decentral data storage in a centralized data management. And we were promising that such a system could also assist visitors in understanding their experience as an interconnected whole. So how did this go? The results can now be evaluated. Each of the proposed products has been developed and delivered, from information stele to the media tower to the visitor guide, through standard media stations and special media installations, bringing us to the most critical users and uses of the media offering under an ultimate evaluation of whether this presentation ends with the display or whether the display begins a connectivity and a dialogue and establishes participation. The final question undecided in the implementation of the digital concept was the online collections display, the longest undecided, unapproved, perhaps misunderstood, leaving the ambitions of a relational data practice for realizing these higher functions in the communication on these collections for a long time up in the air. Now, however, a platform for the online presentation of the collections exhibited in the Humboldt Forum has been produced and published. But how far did it go? Did a decolonization occur in the process, and does this come through in the presentation? These are questions for users to evaluate. If we look at the tasking of this project, we see that the tasking focuses on digitalization and visualization in narrow terms, and the strategic dimension of data linking and enablement of semantic functions is left beyond scope. Availability, Zugänglichkeit, is the focus, and what the project achieves also for some 300,000 objects. But then what now? The opportunity lost, or not yet lost, to activate semantic network effects from digitalized collections data is the opportunity to overcome the atomization and stasis of data in a, I would say, still colonial display. Linked data practice can amplify and grow content by raising isolated details to the function of connecting threads for navigating and exploring meaning in large sets of curated but fluid data. This we had achieved already in an early prototype presented in the Extrema exhibition in 2017, where the collections data was presented for exploration outward from the museum data into worlds of information and towards horizons of knowledge behind the objects. Objects and their isolated units of collection data became doors and paths to the cultures, time periods, places, materials, and collection stories that are ultimately the point, and rather than first and foremost the identity asserting and identity affirming information traditionally forwarded and in catalog practice. But the data is now there. The Ethnologisches Museum and the Museum für Asiatische Kunst, on a content management system of their own, are building out their capacity to reflect and adapt data structures, and their project towards a collaboratives museum will certainly yield big advances in applying this data to the purposes of participatory research. The sub-platform of the Deutsche Digitalbibliothek, dedicated to aggregating data on collections from colonial contexts federally across Germany, has invested in linked data structuring for expressing detailed provenance chains on objects that have been sufficiently researched. This sets a new standard for the role linked data can play in digital collections displays, with the complexities of colonial contexts and continuities as their subject matter and their medium at once. It also sets new standards and expectations for usability. Just to add this example from the Cleveland Museum of Art, where linked object info is curated to offer thematic but as a detailed chain enabling real availability and usability in provenance research. We at the Green Isle think we can go further from this point and are committed to exploring the possibilities in this unprecedented moment, where publicly accessible collections datasets enable a digital curating with museum contents never accessible before for cultural agents outside of the museum. In our initiative since January of this year, Data Futures, we are looking at ways to draw on simple sets of acquisition data to drive powerful interactive visualizations that can tell a big picture story of Berlin's collections history, yielding an unprecedented views and overviews on acquisitions data, like here for South America, since Alexander von Humboldt's visit in 1804, with a screenshot rough from our lab table this morning. We are also dedicated to exploring continuities for already post- and anti-colonial collections, displays, and practices, like the La Flèche collection of the Omaha people, which the Green Isle designed for exhibition in the Humboldt Forum, and for which we see exciting futures in digital forms evolved in the same spirit. These are a few ideas. I hope to exchange more when we have time for questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
Pues tuve la presentación muy mal yo, no personifiqué bien a Alan. Queda la pregunta clave de por qué, si están tan adelantados en la mediación digital, no puede encontrar la base de datos México, sino México con K en alemán. Bueno, veamos. La siguiente presentación es en línea y Enrique ya estaba conectado por ahí, solo que no sé cómo mudarme a esa ventana.
Hola, sí, estoy conectado.
Sí.
¿Puedo compartir mi presentación?
Espera un segundito que están sincronizando las computadoras. Gracias.
Sí, claro, gracias.
Mientras puedes presentarte, ves que no estamos dando introducciones, entonces tú puedes decirnos de dónde vienes, como nombre, todo.
Y bueno, mi nombre es Enrique TRINDADE, soy historiador de la Universidad de São Paulo, acá en Brasil, y gestor del Centro de Investigación, Preservación y Referencia del Museo de la Inmigración acá en São Paulo, Brasil. Ahora puedo compartir. ¿Está bien?
Sí, solo que todavía... Ah, sí, perfecto, ahora se ve bien.
¿Sí?
Sí, te vemos bien.
¿Puedo empezar entonces?
Sí, muchas gracias, Enrique.
Sí, muchas gracias. Entonces, hola, buenas tardes a todos en México. En primer lugar, me gustaría decir que es un placer estar aquí, aunque sea en línea en esta ocasión, y representar, claro, al Museo de la Inmigración del Estado de São Paulo. Y muchísimas gracias también a todos los organizadores del evento. Hoy me gustaría presentar de manera breve algunas perspectivas sobre de documentación, identidades y decolonización sobre el proceso de investigación y curaduría de la nueva exposición de larga duración del Museo de la Inmigración programada para el segundo semestre del próximo año 2024. Para ello considero importante contextualizar, aunque sea de forma rápida, un poco mejor la historia del museo y del edificio en el que se encuentra ubicado. El edificio histórico en el que actualmente funciona el museo era la hospedaría, como un hotel de inmigrantes de São Paulo, construida a fines del siglo XIX para acoger a los inmigrantes recién llegados a Brasil, cuyo destino inicial era trabajar en la agricultura cafetalera del interior de São Paulo. A lo largo del siglo XX, los usos del edificio cambiaron y el perfil de las personas que eran acogidas en él también varió considerablemente según la época. Por ejemplo, fue el hospital adaptado más grande de São Paulo durante la epidemia de gripe española en 1918, prisión política en 1924-1932, refugio para personas sin hogar en São Paulo en 1926 e incluso una escuela de aviación durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. En sus 91 años de historia, es decir, desde 1887 hasta 1978, la Hospedería de São Paulo registró aproximadamente 3,5 millones de personas de más de 70 nacionalidades diferentes y de todas partes de Brasil. Entendido como un patrimonio fundamental en la historia de la inmigración hacia Brasil, el edificio de la antigua Hospedería de São Paulo se convirtió en el Museo de la Inmigración en el año 1993, o sea, lo que significa que este año celebramos 30 años de existencia. Y después de permanecer cerrado por un proceso de restauración entre 2011 y 2014, el Museo de la Inmigración reabrió sus puertas en 2014 en una nueva etapa, en un nuevo contexto de las migraciones en Brasil. La actual exposición de larga duración del museo se titula Migrar, experiencias, memorias e identidades, y fue inaugurada en 2014. Se trató, claro, del principal producto presentado a los visitantes después de 4 años de cierre para la renovación. En lugar de limitarse a promover y celebrar algunos desplazamientos más reconocidos en la historia de São Paulo, principalmente aquellos vinculados a la gran inmigración de los siglos XIX y XX, en esa ocasión la institución buscaba ampliar su alcance, creando un diálogo más amplio entre los procesos del pasado y el presente y tomando como punto de partida común la experiencia humana de migrar. Así, en 8 módulos, la exposición buscaba abordar el proceso migratorio como un fenómeno permanente en la historia de la humanidad, centrándose en la vida cotidiana de la hospedería de inmigrantes, la experiencia de vida y trabajo en el campo, en el pasado, en la historia de São Paulo y en el contexto de las migraciones. Y también la diversidad encontrada en los barrios paulistanos de São Paulo, claro, y los relatos de migrantes del pasado y del presente. A partir de esta propuesta, en los últimos 9 años, el Museo de la Inmigración no solo ha brindado a los visitantes la oportunidad de conocer las trayectorias de migrantes nacionales e internacionales, sino también ha buscado acercarlas a sus propias experiencias, fomentar el diálogo y contribuir a la cultura del respeto y la diversidad. En 2022 asumimos como compromiso para los próximos años la renovación de esta exposición y para ello desarrollamos a lo largo del último año el proyecto 8 años después de migrar, experiencias, memorias e identidades, que tenía como objetivo promover y documentar debates con las evaluaciones críticas de los colaboradores de la institución sobre la actual exposición de larga duración. Desde la reapertura del Museo de la Inmigración, diversos colaboradores representando diversos sectores de la sociedad, como los grupos de migrantes organizados, las instituciones relacionadas con el tema de las migraciones, las autoridades públicas y la comunidad académica, han seguido de cerca la programación museológica promovida, proponiendo y sugiriendo nuevos temas y enfoques en la agenda. Así, entre mayo y octubre de 2022, el equipo de museo organizó visitas técnicas a la exposición con estos colaboradores que pueden ver, seguidas de conversaciones en grupo donde cada uno fue invitado a exponer una visión crítica sobre la exposición actual. Tan solo como ejemplo, durante el primer encuentro con organizaciones de migrantes internacionales, contamos con la presencia de Sarau das Américas, con una representante de Venezuela, Presencia América Latina, con un representante de Bolivia, Conexión Latina de Teatro, con un representante peruano, UARMIS Convergencia de Culturas, con una representante argentina, Visto África, con un representante de Guinea-Bissau, la Red de Mujeres Inmigrantes Lesbianas, Bisexuales y Pansexuales, la Unión Malinesa de São Paulo, el Colectivo de Mujeres Diásporas Africanas y Visto Permanente, que es un colectivo de audiovisual dedicado a filmar y crear visibilidad sobre artistas y agentes culturales inmigrantes. Durante todos los debates que siguieron las visitas a la exposición, se alentó a los participantes a responder a las siguientes preguntas. Si pudiera resumir en un párrafo, ¿cuál sería la narrativa expográfica de la actual exposición de larga duración? ¿Qué grupos no tienen representada su experiencia migratoria en la exposición actual de larga duración? ¿Qué aspectos de la vida, trabajo, ocio, vida familiar están representados en la exposición y de qué manera? ¿Y cómo se utiliza el acervo museológico dentro de la narrativa expositiva, bien como cómo se representa la diversidad en la actual exposición? Las 5 conversaciones en grupo fueron grabadas, transcritas y están disponibles a todos los investigadores que van acá al Museo de la Inmigración. Y 10 conclusiones principales del proyecto tuvieron como resultado. Acá podemos ver unas fotos de los encuentros y acá las 10 conclusiones principales del proyecto. 1. La actual exposición de larga duración no ha superado el desafío planteado en 2014, tal como se expresó en el plan museológico de esa época, de tratar las migraciones como un fenómeno humano más allá de las migraciones históricas. 2. En relación con las migraciones históricas, las escuchas indicaron la necesidad de deshacer la errónea comprensión transmitida por la exposición actual de que la migración histórica se limita a la gran inmigración del siglo XIX de origen europeo. Al evitar esta falsa equivalencia, será posible equilibrar la narrativa dando espacio a las migraciones internas, los desplazamientos de personas negras, indígenas y las migraciones contemporáneas. 3. Las actividades de escucha señalaron una falta de enfoque en la historia del edificio que alberga al Museo de la Inmigración, que, aunque aparentemente contradictorios, realzan la narrativa sobre este patrimonio. Por un lado, el contexto histórico del proyecto de blanqueamiento de la población brasileña que lo generó, y por otro lado, el ejemplo único que representa de implementación de una política pública orientada a la acogida de migrantes nacionales e internacionales. 4. Durante las actividades se reconoció la importancia de seguir explorando el carácter afectivo en torno a las memorias individuales sobre las migraciones. Sin embargo, necesario ampliar la noción de memoria, ofreciendo esta conexión también a las memorias individuales de migrantes internos, personas negras, indígenas y migrantes contemporáneos. 5. El acervo de la institución, así como aquellos vinculados a la memoria de las migraciones históricas, deben ser utilizados en la nueva exposición en un registro que vaya más allá del uso escenográfico. En ese sentido, se señalaron posibilidades como la construcción de vínculos entre los objetos y las narrativas personales, el uso de recursos artísticos, además de la utilización de objetos prestados de otros museos e instituciones. 6. Se percibió la necesidad de utilizar los objetos museológicos de manera más equitativa a lo largo de la nueva exposición, evitando interpretaciones que indiquen una narrativa más destacada para algunos fenómenos migratorios en detrimento de otros. 7. La actual exposición carece de marcos interpretativos basados en la historia nacional de Brasil. En este sentido, se mencionaron elementos importantes como el proyecto de blanqueamiento de la población, la ley de tierras que reorganizó el territorio en el que se produjeron las migraciones, los proyectos urbanos higienistas y los proyectos económicos que reorganizaron las migraciones, así como los proyectos de personas negras e indígenas que también utilizaron el desplazamiento como forma de resistencia en Brasil. 8. Se indicó que la nueva Ley de Inmigración de Brasil de 2017 es un elemento fundamental para incorporar las migraciones contemporáneas. 9. A incluir más experiencias personales, se sugiere dar un mayor equilibrio a la narrativa curatorial, involucrando también la experiencia de las mujeres, los niños y la comunidad LGBTQ+, de manera transversal transversal y distribuida en diferentes temas y periodos. Las migraciones contemporáneas están subrepresentadas en la actual exposición de larga duración. Las migraciones forzadas y el refugio en su conjunto están ausentes, y para la nueva exposición se sugirió la posibilidad de explorar tanto historias individuales como experiencias de líderes reconocidos en el ámbito migratorio. Bueno, estos encuentros fueron absolutamente fundamentales para la concreación y maduración del proceso curatorial de la nueva exposición. Entendimos que era necesario materializar de alguna manera este proyecto, y por lo tanto el equipo del museo desarrolló la instalación Migrar, inquietudes, preguntas y posibilidades, que da título a mi presentación de hoy. Basada en las discusiones promovidas en los encuentros, la instalación sugiere reflexiones a través de estas preguntas, y contó con la participación de dos públicos distintos: brasileños que viven en el extranjero y nos enviaron fotos de objetos que los hacen sentir como en casa, y fotos de objetos de hombres acogidos en el Arsenal da Esperanza, el albergue más grande de América Latina, que también funciona en el edificio de la antigua hospedaría de migrantes vecino al museo. Acá están las preguntas de la instalación. ¿Qué hace que alguien se sienta como en casa? ¿Por qué las personas migran? ¿La frontera libera o limita? ¿Es este el patrimonio de migrar? En todas partes hay un brasileño. Y bueno, este proceso fue único para el museo y su equipo. Logramos elaborar desde diferentes perspectivas y con diversos actores una instalación que resultó de horas y horas de escucha y discusión con personas y organizaciones no solo interesadas y articuladas con los temas migratorios, sino que también ven el museo como un espacio importante de representación y fortalecimiento de identidades, en un espacio de constante disputa de discursos y historias. De esta manera, llegamos a la conclusión de los módulos para nuestra nueva exposición, que se inaugurará el próximo año. En este cuadro es posible visualizar una comparación entre los módulos de la exposición actual y los de la nueva exposición para el año 2024. Ampliar las discusiones sobre identidades y debatir las migraciones y desplazamientos humanos desde la perspectiva de la decolonialidad son partes fundamentales de este proyecto, comprendiendo que la historia de la inmigración no es única, que en la historia de nuestro país ha desencadenado otras resistencias y que debe ser observada desde diversas y complejas perspectivas. Me gustaría concluir mi presentación con dos ejemplos y una pregunta. Las dos exposiciones temporales que están en exhibición en el Museo de la Inmigración hoy refuerzan la importancia de los temas mencionados anteriormente: identidad y decolonialidad. Cheganza, un lugar al sol, un lugar al sur, sobre la presencia de la comunidad haitiana en el sur de Brasil, y realizada por inmigrantes haitianos en Museo, y también donde se esconde el arco iris del artista migrante angoleño Paulo, quien participó en el programa de residencia artística del Museo, así como otros artistas latinos, especialmente en la última ocasión de Argentina y Colombia. Estas y otras obras y proyectos, como las nuevas entrevistas de historia oral, también han contribuido en gran medida a la composición y desarrollo de la nueva exposición. Y para finalizar la pregunta a ustedes, ¿y usted qué historia de migración contaría? Gracias. Estoy a disposición para preguntas y dudas.
Muchas gracias, Enrique. Bueno, primero les anuncio que a las 5:30 tienen que estar puntuales aquellos que se inscribieron para la visita al Museo Tamayo. en la explanada donde han salido los otros autobuses. Para que se puedan ir puntuales los que tienen que estar a las 5:30, tenemos tiempo para un par de preguntas y comentarios. Audiencia, ¿qué sabe? Y no sé si el público en línea también tenga alguna pregunta, comentario. Me van a hacer apoderarme del micrófono, así es que ayúdenme. Yo primero, Enrique, no sé si conociste esta pieza increíble, Cal y Arena, de González Iñárritu. En México la migración es un gran problema y Iñárritu presentó una pieza hace unos años en el Centro Cultural Tlatelolco sobre la experiencia. Él no quería estetizar los procesos de migración porque son muy fuertes en el país, y lo que hizo es que uno viviera la experiencia de cruzar el desierto. Entonces era una experiencia de estas 3D virtuales horriblísima, que te morías de sed. Entonces creo que también falta construir memoria a partir de la experiencia del cuerpo, que uno sienta lo que es estar semanas sin agua, con calor y demás, y sin tener que ser necesariamente migrante para entender de dónde vienen y qué pasa con las caravanas. Y sí, el problema, o sea, entender el problema de la migración y la tristeza de estar en un lugar perdido. Padrísimo, felicidades. ¿No? ¿Nadie más? Yo para Naomi tengo, no una pregunta, muchos comentarios. Hubo una mesa en las mesas anteriores al CIDOC donde se habló de la importancia de la documentación.
Disculpe, porque entiendo más o menos todos, pero un poquito menos rápido.
The previous events around CIDOC, it was a conversation about how important was to document heritage objects, for specifically the talk by, I can't remember her name, Marta Tapia. She's a conservator that is working with police in Mexico to help them to identify stolen objects. Here the police is very normal people trying to identify these objects, and it was very difficult for them to identify these objects because the documentation is very simple. They always say, like, it is an archaeological object with historical value.
Yes.
It's very important for Mexico, something like that, and they were like, yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, just how, but many institutions they don't want to open that information because, as you mentioned, they are worried that this information helps people to localize what is this object, and they can, it's going to be easily stolen, so they don't want to open those data. So how you, at the end, try to give an agreement. How can we protect our heritage without open those databases? I don't know how to do it. Just say that you didn't know how to
I
do
don't
it
know.
as well.
No, I think you're putting there's two challenges here that I recognize a lot. One is how do you evaluate the importance of archaeological heritage, or how do you evaluate the value of it? In terms of the law, in Mexico, but also in many other Latin American states and also in Europe, that's actually that's relatively easy. In the sense that the law simply dictates that it's all material. So it doesn't matter if it is a, the sunstone, for example, or if it is a small, everyday, day-to-day object, for example. So effectively, that is, the law tells us, okay, everything is important. The problem is identifying the importance. And many, even dedicated art and heritage police officers, they lack art historical knowledge, which makes a lot of sense because they're not art historians. But also, if you have art historical knowledge, you're not necessarily an expert on every single culture that has ever existed, right? And we are talking about hundreds of years of material. I mean, I went to the Anthropology Museum yesterday. That was, beyond. So the problem is effectively not necessarily in saying, okay, this is of value, because the law and technically it all is. The problem is, how do you evaluate what it then precisely is? What community, for example, does it belong to? Is it effectively looted or stolen? Is there a burden of proof? Can you determine if things are stolen, yes or no? Databases can come in. That was the second part of your question or of your comments. Databases can come in the sense that there should be a sort of a mix of databases, which they try to, but there should be interoperability between registries and also the ability to register, because it's really not easy to register archaeological heritage sites and identify every single object they're in and then create a registry and then necessarily enforce it, because if we're talking about policing, that would mean that you would have to have a cop of some sorts in every single space. That is just impossible. But databases could be a solution, although taken very carefully, in the sense that they are databases like, for example, Ecom's Red List, that identify objects that are most at risk. Because there are objects that are most at risk from looting or from trafficking, and I think a combination of a database that is an open registry that might not be open to absolutely everyone, because then the problem of locating heritage sites or archaeological sites comes in, but a sort of semi-public open registry, Web3 style, where there's no platforms anymore, but just really an open web space where you, this goes against what I just said, but where you, Interpol style, where you have to register in order to get to that information. And if you have solid reasons to get to that information, because you're an academic or because you're a police officer or because you're private security or because you're an owner or you are a conservator of a heritage site, or you are a state, you are a community, then perhaps that should be accessible. But if you truly want to stop something like this from happening, looting, trafficking, enforcement, then sites need to be documented and sites need to be enforced. And those two things are just very complicated to realize. Yeah.
And I'm thinking that the link that I found in your presentations is that if these objects belong to the people, to the communities, and these communities are moving from their places, they are migrating all the time, then are we committing a crime taking those objects, if those objects belong not to a country but to the people of that country?
Oh, that's a very good comment. Yeah, that's a whole other ballpark. There is a United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that, in one way or another, provides in the restitution return of heritage to communities, as opposed to towards states. The majority of restitution claims will be, or restitution policies that I know, at least in the Netherlands, at least in my context, is from state to state. And yeah, there's a famous example of a Moai. I point there because it's Chilean, but of a Moai, the giant statues that are on Rapa Nui, for those of you who don't know, and a claim, they want to make a claim for the return of one of the Moai, but they are struggling or hesitating, a community, not all Rapa Nui, but a community is struggling because, they don't necessarily want to do that through the Chilean state, because Rapa Nui, in that sense, also considers itself as an annexed territory, so not Chilean, but restitution, when it happens only from state to state, you come, but this is exactly the problem that emerges, because, the Moai might, I am inventing now, but it could be the case that, okay, you make a claim, you get the restitution, the object comes back, but then perhaps the object comes back to Chile and it ends up in the Pre-Columbian Museum in Santiago de Chile and not actually in the community. And that is a big problem. And that was also, I think that is, Enrique, my Spanish is not great, but I think that was one of the things that you were also talking about. There's tensions there also in almost this homogenizing homogenizing of indigenous people or homogenizing of states, which are of course not homogeneous. Indigenous people are not simply all the same category, just like a state is not simply one entity. So yeah, that is exactly the issue.
And have you encountered these objects coming from these? Every time that I use the word community, it always have this idea that is indigenous community, but I'm talking about transsexuals. Contemporary communities are also moving from one country to another, and those are also migrating, and they are taking objects with them. If those objects are stolen, I don't know if...
I mean, as a criminologist, it's rather simple, because effectively, if I mean, at one moment you have a statute of limitations, which means that at one moment you cannot be punished, let's say, for a crime anymore. It also depends as to how objects moves before or after administrative laws were implemented, in what context. It's unfortunately, yeah, it's not easy, but I think especially in Latin America, the development of the modern nation and the modern nation state came in, right, which also just simply cut through the territories of indigenous peoples that were at that time. So there, of course, the law doesn't fit the laws doesn't fit the pre-development of the state, and the laws were not even existing at that time. So yeah, I mean, I personally think this should not be a legal question at all. We are talking about, this is a moral, ethical concern that we have. But yeah, we do have legal frameworks, they exist. But when we talk about colonial roots or pre-colonial times, yeah, then it becomes more a moral, ethical consideration, because we don't have necessarily a massive legal framework to work with. Yeah.
Thank you. Enrique, perdón, ¿algún comentario breve? Que te robé el micrófono.
No, tranquilo. I understand a little bit, Naomi. But creo, voy a hablar en español, pero creo que en otro contexto la dificultad que nosotros tenemos es cómo coleccionar la migración contemporánea, por ejemplo, ¿no? Que objetos que vamos a elegir si están en uso por los migrantes, ¿no? Cómo coleccionar, cómo preservar la historia que está ahí se pasando hoy, y al mismo tiempo cuando hablamos de comunidades indígenas en São Paulo, que parece creo que para mucha gente que no hay comunidades indígenas en una ciudad tan grande como São Paulo, pero hay muchas comunidades y son comunidades de resistencia. Del mismo modo, los quilombos, estamos haciendo proyectos para que ellos eligen, conversen, establezcan conversaciones con nosotros, y también para hablar sobre los desplazamientos negros e indígenas en Brasil, que es algo muy importante y que tiene, claro, relación con la inmigración como un todo. Entonces creo que para nosotros la mayor dificultad es ser un museo que todos quieren estar representados. Siempre es un lugar de disputa, siempre de discursos, y al mismo tiempo cómo dialogar y coleccionar la migración contemporánea.
Muy difícil, no tienes respuesta, seguramente. Pues bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Les recuerdo, tienen 2 minutos para llegar a la explanada y coger el camión que va para el Museo Tamayo. Muchas gracias por conectarte, Enrique. Qué bonita presentación. Muchas gracias, Naomi, por venir hasta acá. A todos, buenas tardes. Nos vemos mañana. Sigamos siendo críticos. Disfruten su visita al Tamayo. Y buenas tardes. Hasta luego. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.